Well, an ancient discovery is shedding light on the early church. The Megiddo Mosaic dates back nearly 2,000 years, and experts believe it decorated one of the earliest Christian worship sites in Israel.
For 15 centuries, a secret slept under the wet soil of the Galilee. Experts insisted we already had every recorded word Jesus ever gave his disciples.
Today on the newscast, an incredible new archaeological discovery from the time of Jesus found on the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
But a dig on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee proved otherwise. Beneath layers of mud, a buried church floor has revealed a message untouched since the Byzantine age.
Wow, look at that! Oh, it's just coming to life. That's unbelievable. My brain is exploding right now.
A message tied directly to Jesus and Peter, and what it suggests could shake the story billions grew up believing. The church hidden under Galilee's mud. On the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, near where the Jordan River enters the lake, there is a low stretch of land called El-Araj. It sits right beside the water. The ground is flat, muddy, and thick with reeds and shallow pools. For a long time, it looked like nothing more than a useless swamp. Most archaeologists ignored it and focused on higher, drier ground nearby. The reason was practical. The groundwater here lies just below the surface, so any excavation trench quickly fills with lake water. Early surveys found a few stones and broken pottery, but nothing that seemed important. Local fishermen saw the place differently. During severe droughts, when the lake level dropped, they noticed straight stone lines appearing in the exposed mud. These didn't look natural. Researchers who study ancient shorelines added a crucial insight. By examining old harbor remains and layers of lake sediment, they concluded that during the early Roman period, the Sea of Galilee was several feet lower than it is today. That means the marshy area at El-Araj would once have been solid ground right at the water's edge, an ideal place for a lakeside village. One veteran fisherman and scholar, Mendel Nunn, spent decades mapping ancient harbor traces around the lake. His research suggested that today's lake level may be about 3 feet higher than it was in the centuries after Christ. If that's correct, a village that once sat along the shore could now be buried beneath river silt and flood deposits. Suddenly, El-Araj no longer looked like a useless swamp. It began to look like the drowned edge of a real long-lost town. By the early 2000s, the search for the lost town of Bethsaida had turned into a serious dispute. One group of scholars argued that it lay on a ruined hill farther inland. Another group kept pointing to this flooded strip of land near the modern shoreline. Eventually, debate wasn't enough. Someone had to dig. A team decided to test the muddy ground at El-Araj and find out what, if anything, was buried beneath it. The El-Araj excavation project was set up as a joint effort between the Kinneret Institute for Galilee Archaeology at Kinneret College and a partner college in the United States. The work was led by archaeologists Mordecai Aviam and Stephen Notley. They started with small test pits in the mid-2000s. When those early digs hinted that something more might be there, they moved on to full summer excavation seasons. Their equipment was basic: shovels, trowels, measuring tools, and a web of pumps and hoses to keep the water level down. The goal was straightforward. Was there a settlement buried here, and when did people live in it? Digging at El-Araj was nothing like the tidy version of archaeology seen in films. The summer heat was heavy, insects swarmed out of the reeds, and the soaked ground clung to boots and tools. Every trench filled again and again with groundwater, forcing the pumps to run for hours each day just to keep the deepest layers exposed. The moment the pumps stopped, water crept back in, turning clean trenches into shallow, muddy pools. Even so, year after year, the team returned and pushed the excavations deeper. The upper layers held the same mix found at many old sites: rubble from later farm buildings, bits of glazed pottery, and even the occasional modern bottle. Deeper down, the soil began to change and more serious remains appeared, but nothing formed a clear picture yet. Broken wall tops, fallen plaster, and late pottery hinted at buildings, but the layout still made little sense. That shifted when a trowel hit stone with a sharp, clean tap. As the soil was brushed away, a straight edge appeared, then a clear right angle. This wall didn't twist or wander like a rough farm wall, it ran solid and straight. As the trench widened, more walls emerged, set neatly at right angles and running east to west. At the eastern end, a curved section came into view, built from carefully fitted stones. To anyone familiar with early churches, the shape was instantly recognizable. Over the next seasons, the plan became clear. The team had uncovered a large basilica from the Byzantine period when the Eastern Roman Empire controlled the region. There was a long central hall with side aisles, where rows of columns once stood. At the eastern end, a rounded apse marked the place where an altar had been. Along one side, smaller rooms opened off the main hall. One of them, close to the front, matched the size and position of a sacristy, a service room used by clergy. The building stretched roughly 80 to 90 feet long and more than 50 feet across, large enough to handle steady flows of visitors. This was not a small village chapel. It was a purpose-built pilgrimage church, designed to impress and to draw people in. The way the building was made matched its size and purpose. Its foundations were cut deep into older layers. Thick stone walls once carried a high roof. Even though earthquakes and centuries of neglect had brought the upper parts down, the outline was still clear enough to map in detail. In the late 5th or early 6th century after Christ, someone had invested serious money and labor to turn this stretch of lakeshore into a formal holy site. Once the walls were mapped, attention shifted to the floors. In a side room near the rounded end of the church, careful scraping began to reveal something unexpected. Beneath the gray silt lay a surface made of tiny stone cubes set into mortar. At first, only simple white and black areas appeared. Then thin lines of red, yellow, and blue emerged. Slowly, a floral design with curling vines and borders came into view. At the center of the room, those borders formed a circle marked by two thin, dark rings. Inside the circle ran lines of Greek letters, arranged as a formal inscription, not just decoration. Cleaning the mosaic took time and care. Conservators used soft brushes, small amounts of water, and gentle chemicals to remove dirt and salt without loosening the stones. Every curve and letter was photographed and drawn. Once the floor was fully recorded, parts of it were covered again to protect it until specialists could study the inscription more closely. While one group worked on the walls and mosaics, another dug beneath the basilica floor. Below a layer of mixed rubble and river silt, they reached a very different kind of settlement. Instead of wide halls, they found small rooms with packed earth floors and plain stone walls. The pottery here belonged to earlier styles, and the coins pointed to the first centuries after Christ. The smaller finds filled in the picture of everyday life. In one house after another, excavators uncovered clusters of lead weights and stone net sinkers, the basic tools of people who made their living by fishing. They also found plain cooking pots, storage jars, and table bowls. In one building, they came across a rare bronze inkwell lying among the fishing weights. It was an unusual pairing, suggesting a household where someone worked on the lake but also kept written records. Nearby, remains of a Roman-style bath complex appeared. Pieces of mosaic, water channels, and short stone pillars showed where a heated floor had once been. A simple fishing village does not usually build a full public bath. This pointed to a shoreline community that had grown into a more developed Roman-era town before later shrinking again. What the team uncovered was not a random church dropped into open countryside. It was a major basilica built directly over an older lakeside village, on ground that once rang with the sounds of boats, nets, and everyday trade. To understand why anyone chose that exact spot for such an imposing church, you have to go back to a time when the village still had its original name and a busy shoreline, long before mud and water slowly erased it from view. Bethsaida, the lost hometown of the apostles. Bethsaida began as a working town with a plain, practical name. In the local language, it meant something like house of fishing or place of fishing, a clear sign that this was a community built around nets and boats, not palaces. In the 1st century, life there moved to the rhythm of the lake. Before dawn, men pushed wooden boats into the water. Nets went out and came back heavy with fish. Along the shore, families spread the nets to dry and sorted the catch into baskets. Much of the fish was salted or dried for sale, and tax agents working for local rulers took their cut. The New Testament places 3 of Jesus' early followers in this setting. The Gospel of John names Bethsaida as the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, fishermen who became among his first disciples. In another scene, people who want to meet Jesus go to Philip first, and he turns to Andrew as if the two men were natural intermediaries. For early Christians, this tied the town directly to the beginning of the Jesus movement. Two well-known stories are also set around Bethsaida. One happens at the edge of the town. People bring a blind man to Jesus and ask for help. Jesus leads him outside, moistens his eyes, and asks what he can see. The man says that people look like trees walking. Only after a second touch does his sight become clear. That two-stage healing is unique in the Gospels and makes Bethsaida the setting for an unusually personal moment. The other story unfolds in open country nearby. After a long stretch of teaching, Jesus and his disciples cross the lake to a quiet area close to Bethsaida. Crowds track their boat along the shore and arrive in the same lonely place. Evening comes. People are hungry, and the food on hand is tiny compared to the number of people. The Gospels say that thousands sit down on green grass, eat from a few loaves and fish, and still leave with baskets of leftovers. All four accounts of this feeding point back to the countryside near Bethsaida, yet the Gospels also attach a warning to this place. In one set of sayings, Jesus mentions Bethsaida alongside Chorazin and Capernaum and speaks a woe over them. He says that if the same wonders had been done in foreign cities like Tyre and Sidon, those places would have turned their lives around, but Bethsaida did not. Because of that, its future in judgment would be harder. Outside the Bible, a Jewish historian named Josephus fills in another part of the story. He explains that Herod Philip, one of the sons of Herod the Great, ruled this northern region under Roman authority. Josephus says that Philip took the village of Bethsaida and turned it into a small city. He also renamed it Julius after a woman from the Roman imperial family. Turning a fishing village into a city meant more than a new name. It meant more building, more people, and deeper ties to Roman power. Archaeology and written sources give a sense of how that change played out on the ground. Paths that once simply followed the slope down to the lake were straightened into more formal streets. Public buildings and a marketplace were added to what had been a mix of small workshops. A bathhouse, the kind commonly found in Roman towns, likely appeared as well. Fishing and farming still supported the local economy, but the town now felt like a small regional center. For a time, this upgraded Bethsaida Julius seems to have done well. Then the record grows thin. By the later 3rd and 4th centuries, Bethsaida slips out of most written sources. Historians point to several causes that probably worked together. River channels can move and spread silt over low ground, lake levels can shift, and trade routes can change with wars or new rulers. Step by step, a busy town on the water can become a half-buried ruin in reeds and mud. Even as the bricks fell and the shoreline changed, the name did not vanish. In the Byzantine and early medieval periods, Christian pilgrims went around the Sea of Galilee, visiting places linked with gospel stories. A 6th-century churchman named Theodosius wrote a short guide to the Holy Land and mentioned Bethsaida among the sites around the lake. About 2 centuries later, a Bavarian bishop named Willibald made a long pilgrimage through the region. In the written account of his journey, he describes traveling around the Sea of Galilee, reaching an area called Bethsaida, and seeing a church built over what locals said had been the house of the apostles Peter and Andrew, where he stayed overnight. Modern archaeologists tried to match these written memories to real places, which led them to El-Araj and the ringed mosaic floor with inscriptions found there. The inscription on that mosaic didn't just decorate the floor, it dropped a bombshell. The hidden message on the church floor. Inside a ring on the mosaic floor, written in a language over 1,400 years old,
a mosaic floor with inscriptions from a 1,500-year-old structure, a structure that is believed to be the lost church.
Someone spelled out how they thought heaven was ordered and where Peter stood in that order. The text starts in a very simple way. It names a man called Constantine and calls him a servant of Christ. This is not the famous emperor. It is almost surely a local believer with enough money to help pay for part of the building or its decoration. Then comes the line that makes this floor stand out. The inscription turns to Peter and calls him the chief and commander of the heavenly apostles. That powerful title did not come out of nowhere. In late ancient sermons and prayers, Christian writers often called Peter the chief of the apostles, or the leader of the apostolic band, and some spoke of him as the one who holds the keys of heaven. The mosaic at this church shows that this way of talking about him had moved beyond books and into everyday worship. The keys in that title point back to one of the best-known lines in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells Peter that he is the rock on which a new community will be built, and that he will give him the keys of the kingdom of heaven.
Peter is both the chief of the apostles and the keeper of the keys of the kingdom of heaven.
In plain language, keys mean authority. If you carry the keys to a house or a gate, you decide who comes in and who stays out. Over many centuries, Christian art has fixed that picture so deeply that Peter almost always appears with big keys in his hand. Another scene deepens that picture of trust. At the end of the Gospel of John, after breakfast on a beach, Jesus speaks to Peter, the same Peter who had denied even knowing him during the trial. Jesus asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And each time Peter answers yes, Jesus gives him a task: feed my lambs, take care of my sheep. In plain terms, Peter is told to look after people, not just speak to them. In front of the other followers, the man who failed is restored and given a role built entirely on care. Across the centuries, that special role has raised a sharp question. Does this treatment make Peter the single head of the church, or is he a first among equals, honored but not far above the rest? In Catholic teaching, Peter is remembered as the first bishop of Rome with a unique authority linked to those promises. Many Protestant churches still see him as the most visible early leader, but say the words about the rock and the keys belong to the whole church, or to all the apostles together, not to one permanent office. The stones at the lakeshore do not end that debate, but they do show how one small community answered it in practice. Floors like this worked almost like short sermons in stone. Many people in those centuries could not read long books. They learned what to believe from hymns, from icons and paintings, and from brief inscriptions where their feet passed every day. A mosaic in a sacristy did more than brighten a room. It summed up what donors and priests believed about Peter, about heaven, and about help after death. Scholars who study the early Christian world use a Greek word for sayings of Jesus that live outside the 4 familiar Gospels. They call them agrapha, a term that basically means not written down.
That the agrapha refer to statements purporting to come from Jesus that are not reported in the 4 canonical Gospels.
The name is a little ironic because these sayings are known only because someone did write them down outside the 4 Gospels, but it captures the idea that they fell outside the main written story of Jesus' life. Some of these sayings appear in other New Testament books, in early letters and sermons, or in later copies of the Bible where a scribe has slipped an extra line into the margin or between verses. One of the clearest examples sits in the book of Acts. Paul talks to church elders and reminds them of a line from Jesus. He tells them to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, that it is more blessed to give than to receive. That sentence is treated as a direct saying from Jesus, yet it appears in none of the 4 Gospels. It is a classic case of a floating saying that the first believers kept and passed on, even though it never made it into Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Other early writings and hand-copied manuscripts carry more of these short lines, some close in tone to the Sermon on the Mount. Taken together, they show that Christians kept quoting and shaping the words of Jesus outside the written Gospels, even as the main stories of his life were being copied and spread. Historians do not treat every claimed saying as equal. When they meet a line of speech that is not in the 4 familiar Gospels, they ask how early the source is, whether the saying appears in more than one stream of writing, and whether the tone fits what the oldest sayings of Jesus already sound like. Even when a saying looks promising, many experts still mark it as probable or possible rather than certain. The inscription at the lakeshore fits into that wider world, but in a careful way. The phrases on the floor are not introduced as a quote from Jesus. They are titles and images that grow out of passages people already knew, such as the promise of the keys and the call to feed the flock.
I mean, look at this. It's extraordinary. The entire inscription is here. This is the first time the world has seen this in 1,400 years.
Yep.
At the same time, those titles do not come straight from any verse. They are this community's way of putting into words how they understood Peter's place between earth and heaven. Follow that thread out from this one room, and it leads far beyond the shore of the lake. Once people notice that not every remembered saying of Jesus sits neatly inside the 4 Gospels, They start looking for those loose lines in other places, from letters and early preaching notes to cracked tiles and old scraps of papyrus. Jesus' lost words. Some of the clearest extra traces of Jesus' voice turned up in places no one in the first century would have called holy, like city garbage dumps on the edge of the Egyptian desert and jars of forgotten books buried near village fields. South of modern Cairo, the ruins of an old town called Oxyrhynchus sit near a dry branch of the Nile. In Roman times, it was a busy provincial city with markets and crowded streets. People dumped their rubbish on low mounds outside the houses, and the dry air and sand slowly covered those heaps. Without meaning to, the townspeople built layer on layer of preserved paper and ink. In the late 19th century, two British scholars, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, came to Oxyrhynchus to look for old writing. Workers dug into the mounds and pulled out scraps of papyrus. The team found private letters, tax notes, parts of lost Greek plays, and early Christian texts. Among the fragments were small pieces where short lines all began with simple words like "Jesus says," followed by sayings that did not match any passage in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John word for word.
The most important papyrus was found at the start of the dig, a sensational biblical manuscript. It contained sayings attributed to Jesus.
One scrap has Jesus say that unless a person turns away from the world, they will never find God's kingdom. Another tiny fragment says, "Raise the stone and there you will find me. Split the wood and I am there," a line that never appears in the four Gospels. Later studies showed that some sayings echoed known verses, while others had no clear match. Scholars are cautious about calling any one line a lost quote, but the pattern is clear. Long after the first disciples died, believers in this Egyptian city were still copying brief teachings from Jesus on loose sheets that could end up in the trash. His remembered words were still alive outside the books that later formed the New Testament. Another major find came from Egypt in the middle of the 20th century. Near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, local farmers digging for soil broke open a tall clay jar buried near some cliffs. Inside, they found leather-bound books written in Coptic, the later form of the Egyptian language. Most of the pages reached the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where scholars realized they were looking at an ancient library that had been sealed and hidden for many centuries. One of the books from that jar is now called the Gospel of Thomas.
The Gospel of Thomas is preserved in its entirety in a single Coptic text from the Nag Hammadi library, a hoard of early Christian texts discovered in the mid-20th century.
It does not read like the story-shaped Gospels in the New Testament. There is no birth story, no list of miracles, and no final drama in Jerusalem. Instead, it is almost pure speech. The text sets out 114 short sayings, most introduced with the words, "Jesus said." Some sayings echo the four Gospels closely. Others talk about finding the kingdom inside you, or about knowing yourself, in a way that sounds more like short puzzles than simple teaching. One line has Jesus tell his followers that the Father's kingdom is spread out over the earth, and people do not see it. Another says that when people truly come to know themselves, they will understand that they are children of the living Father. A different saying warns that if leaders tell you the kingdom is up in the sky or deep in the sea, then the birds and the fish will get there before you, because the kingdom is already inside you and all around you. Most experts think the Gospel of Thomas, in the form we have it, was written in the 2nd century, probably in Syria or Egypt, using even earlier collections of sayings. Greek fragments from Oxyrhynchus match parts of Thomas, which suggests that some of the same lines were already in circulation generations before the Coptic copy was made. Large churches later did not accept Thomas as scripture, and some leaders warned believers away from it. Today, historians read it as a window into one stream of early Christian belief, where Jesus is remembered mainly as a teacher who speaks brief, sharp sentences that promise deeper understanding to people who grasp them. Not every trace of Jesus' extra words comes in neat lists. Some appear inside early story collections that look like alternative gospels. One of the most important is a damaged manuscript now called Papyrus Egerton II. The surviving sheets, likely copied in the late 2nd century, preserve parts of scenes in which Jesus debates with religious leaders, performs a healing, and speaks about faith. None of the passages matches any single section of the New Testament Gospels, yet the tone feels close enough that many scholars see them as relatives rather than pure inventions. In one scene, Jesus tells a group of experts in the law something like, You search the writings because you think you find life in them, but those same writings point toward me, and you still will not trust me. In another, after a healing, he warns the man who has been helped with words close to, "Go and show yourself to the priests, and do not fall back into disbelief." Other clues about missing words do not come from full Gospels at all. They show up as one-line quotes scattered through early Christian letters, sermons, and commentaries. Writers like Clement of Alexandria kept a few of these lines. One example has Jesus say that people should ask for the greater things, and the smaller things will be added as well. Another urges believers to be like experts in money, testing and rejecting what is false and holding firmly to what is true, a picture that later writers summed up as being good money changers. Other early sources speak of Jesus saying that the one who stays close to him is close to fire, and the one who stays far from him is far from the kingdom, a short, sharp way of saying that staying near him is demanding but life-giving. In a teaching handbook called the Didache, a line often treated as a saying of Jesus tells believers, "Let your gift sweat in your hands until you know to whom you should give it," a push to be careful and thoughtful with charity instead of giving just to ease guilt. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.